Hi everyone, welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I'm your host, David Thompson. Today it's my privilege to be joined by Lisa Tendrich Frank, an historian and recent author of The Civilian War, Confederate Women and Union Soldiers During Sherman's March, which is now out with LSU Press. So Dr. Frank, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We have recently wrapped up here the sesquicentennial of the war, but obviously that would incorporate Sherman's march towards the end of it here in the fall of last year into the spring of this year. So there have been several books that have come out on the march, and yours is one of them. So I wondered if you could help just explain a little bit in terms of what your book is generally about, because it does deviate from some of the other scholarship that has come out.
Sure. The Civilian War focuses on the gendered aspects of Sherman's march, so how Union soldiers and Confederate women thought about each other and how they reacted to each other and how gender affected that. So where most studies of Sherman's march focus on the march taking the military material out of the Confederacy and breaking the morale of Southerners, the Civilian War focuses on how it was designed specifically to demoralize women. It's a campaign that's designed to go into women's houses, to go into their private spaces, and not necessarily only impact food for the soldiers, but rather personal items of the women. So soldiers are constantly going into women's bedrooms and into their parlors. They're tearing up their wedding gowns. They're dancing on pianos. They're doing things that insult women, but don't necessarily help the war effort in the way we generally understand it.
Now, what inspired you to pursue such a topic?
Well, I've always been interested in the people of the Civil War and what they thought about war, why they supported war, or why they didn't support war. And when I was in graduate school, I read an article by Drew Faust that talked about women's morale flagging and that being the reason why the Confederacy lost the war. And at the same time, I was reading Leanne White's article about gender in the Civil War. And as I started doing my research on how Confederate women's support was affected by the military losses, it started out sort of focusing on those reactions, but became more and more about gender and how the fact of them being women affected how they reacted to the war and how the Union soldiers treated them because they were women. So it became more about the crisis in gender, as Leanne White had termed it, and less just about a reaction to something, but more of this constant interplay between Union men and Southern women and what that meant for the Confederacy and the Union.
Now, I wondered if we could kind of shift the focus here a little bit just to talk a bit about the source material. Obviously, when you're tackling a topic of this nature, you do have to be mindful of what people are saying about the events and when they're actually saying them. So I won't give it away here. I'm sure you'll talk about the perils of memoirs, which many historians face when they're addressing topics. So I wonder, how did you kind of decide on what to focus on in terms of what to incorporate? What did you consciously avoid? Was this a process that it was a concerted effort from the beginning, or was it something in time you came to realize was probably best practices, I guess?
Well, from the beginning, I was focusing on the letters that women wrote during the march and immediately after the march, and also the men's letters, although primarily I was just focusing on the women at first and reading their diaries. And there's such a rich sources in these diaries. I mean, they give so many details and they have so much information. So for a while, it didn't even occur to me to ignore the memoirs. I just wasn't even looking at the memoirs. And as the project progressed, I started actively avoiding the memoirs and the oral histories that were passed down. Just in fact that women's reactions at the moment would be more, I don't want to say accurate, but sort of give you a better impression of what was happening to them and how they experienced it, as opposed to how they remembered it 20 years later or 40 years later or even 5 years later. So I did, in the end, as a whole, actively avoid the memoirs. And even though you go into every archives, and I would go and I would have my list of things to look for, and then the archivist would come up with, some more suggestions. And almost always the archivist would also have some old family story about what happened when Sherman was coming through Georgia, what happened when Sherman was, entering Columbia. And they're fascinating stories, but it tells a very different tale of Sherman's march. And then you have to get involved in, how did memory affect this? And how do you deal with that? So I just avoided that. And I really did want to focus more on the immediate response, the immediacy of how it impacted them.
Now, in the build up to the actual march, what were the expectations, I guess you could say, of Southern women, realizing that Union forces are eventually going to make their way into this part of the Confederacy that, by and large, had avoided the scourge of war up to this point, at least from a direct confrontation with Union soldiers?
Sure. At the very beginning, women just assume that it's going to be another occupied area, like the women in Atlanta. When Atlanta is being bombarded, they're experiencing the horrors of being under siege, but they assume that if Atlanta is captured, they will have to possibly sign a loyalty oath or just deal with living amongst Union soldiers. What they don't expect is that they will be evicted from Atlanta once Sherman takes the town. So then women in other Southern towns where Sherman eventually gets to, as they see the Union troops approaching, they have a different kind of fear. They wonder if they're going to be kicked out of their homes. But they have now seen, or heard, not seen obviously firsthand, but read in letters, read in newspaper reports, gotten word from family members that Sherman's soldiers will most likely come into their houses and do something in the houses. So the women further along the march are starting to hide things in their bedrooms. They're hiding things in their mattresses. They're hiding things in babies' cribs. They're often wearing multiple layers of clothing, sometimes with pockets sewn in them to hide either valuables or personal letters. A lot of women are burning their diaries or hiding them because once Sherman's getting to South Carolina, they've read reports of women's letters that were taken from their homes, being sent northward, and being published in newspapers. And they don't want this to happen to them. So they start protecting things that normally, the military, they have no idea that the military would touch these things. But now that they've heard rumors of this and sometimes seen actual evidence of this, they start preparing that way. Some of them flee to safety, they think, to safety. But many of them stay in their homes because they feel like if they're in their houses, they may, someone may come into their house, but their house won't be burned down. So they feel like they can offer some sort of protection. And they also, almost all these, and I focus on white slaveholding women, almost all of them sort of feel like because they're elite women, they have certain rights that Union men will not cross certain boundaries. This is sometimes the case, sometimes not, but they prepare with that in mind. They're afraid of rape, but they feel some assurance that they won't be raped.
And conversely, how are Union soldiers and the Union higher command approaching this march and what their expectations are in terms of how they will act?
Well, a lot has been made of the fact that Sherman doesn't, tell his soldiers go into the houses and tear up wedding gowns and the things that they do. But there is, if you read the soldiers' letters, you read Sherman's letters, there is a sense that they're going in there to punish Southern women. So they're preparing not just to tear up the railroads, which they certainly want to do. I mean, Sherman lays out exactly how to rip up the railroad lines and bend the railroad ties, but also a sense that they want to demoralize these women. They want to take them out of the war. They understand elite Southern women as the people who both sent the soldiers off to fight the Union, to help enlist the get enlistees into the Confederate Army, but also the people who are still supporting them by sending them letters and by sending them uniforms and all the things they need on the battlefront. So both in Sherman's letters and soldiers' letters, they're talking about how can they punish these women. How can they make these women feel like war is, and one of them puts it, not a holiday parade. We want to show them that it's not just fun to go to war. It's not just something for balls and, watching battles and things like that, but rather war is very harsh and they need to feel it. And maybe once they feel it, they'll stop. They'll give up, and then eventually we'll bring this war to a close.
So when expectations morph into realities or transition towards realities, what is actually happening here on the ground as these soldiers are moving through? How are these Southern women being treated? And ultimately, kind of what's the immediate legacy of these acts?
The soldiers are coming through, and sometimes they're marching through fields. They're eating off the land. They're living off the land. This is one of the big things Sherman wants to do, is cut off all communications with the trains and things like that. both because he says it'll help him move faster, but also it keeps it away from the Confederates. So the soldiers are basically swarming. They're eating all the food, and when they come to homes, sometimes they're taking charge of the homes and, kicking the women out and saying, this is our headquarters. But in almost all these cases, there are these confrontations between the Union soldiers and these slave-holding women, where the soldiers want to get into the houses, the women don't want them there, but they have very little power to keep them out. So there's a lot of verbal confrontations, sometimes physical. Sometimes the men do physically search the women's bodies for things, and you hear about that in their letters. I mean, they're outraged by this. They're outraged if it happens to them. They're outraged if they hear about it happening to someone else. The men are going in there, like I mentioned earlier, sometimes they're dancing on pianos. There are lots of stories, both from the Southern women and the Union soldiers, talking about the soldiers forcing the women to play music on the piano for them, and then either afterwards the soldiers will either smash the piano with an axe or somehow destroy these things, pour syrup over them to make them unusable. The soldiers are going into these bedrooms, and a lot of women hid things in their bedrooms when they were preparing, assuming that even if the soldiers came into their houses, it would be like into the kitchens, into the areas that were more public. But instead, the soldiers are frequently going into their bedrooms and ripping apart the mattresses where they've hid the money, and ripping apart their drawers, tearing apart their lingerie. And the women are usually verbally responding to this. They're not going to push a soldier. They're not generally, taking out a gun and shooting someone. But there's a lot of back and forth, verbal confrontations between them.
And then, so what's, I guess, pushing this a little further, what is the kind of the legacy as the war ends, in the immediate aftermath of the treatment of these Southern women? How are they remembering things in the immediate aftermath, and perhaps how does that kind of play into immediate post-war life as we move into Reconstruction? How are they feeling about what just occurred?
They're not happy about it. And these letters that I was talking about, where they're writing, what's happened either that day or that night, and often the letters go on for pages, and it's almost in a diary form where they've kept track every day of what's happened as Union troops have come through. These letters serve to both, I think, get women in other parts of the Confederacy to understand what's happening and feel like it's happening to them as well. And these women are very angry at what's happening. They feel violated. So even though they're not always physically raped, they feel like in some ways they've been violated and their personal things have been torn apart. And instead of them giving up, which is what Union soldiers hoped would happen, what Sherman hoped would happen, they get angrier. And they feel like the Union men have a different idea about civilization than they do, that they're a different race. They'll talk about the Yankees are a separate race from us. And so instead of it being an easy thing to get over, they don't feel like they can reunify with the Union. They don't feel like they have any business talking to men who would do such horrible things to them. The women are frequently referred to Sherman as a brute, as a monster. And this doesn't just go to Sherman. They sort of talk about Sherman and his troops as sort of one big entity. And Union soldiers also see that these women are not as easy to convince that they should just give up on the Confederacy as they thought it would be. I don't look all that much into the legacy. Like, I don't look into the post-war legacy of it. My focus is really the actual march. But one of the legacies that I do talk about is right immediately after the march, the Confederate soldiers whose families have experienced Sherman's march, who have had to worry about their wives and their daughters and their mothers and their sons and, their relatives basically encountering Sherman's men, they're the ones who often give up. They're the ones who feel like somehow they haven't done what they were supposed to do. They went off to war to protect the Confederacy, but also to protect their families, to protect their communities. And by allowing Sherman and his men to come through, they've obviously failed in that. So the more immediate legacy would be that it may not convince Southern women to give up on the war, at least not these white slaveholding women, but it does often convince the Confederate men, the soldiers from Georgia and the Carolinas, to give up. So most of the women are not writing, "Come home and help us." They're saying, "Stay on the battlefield and kill more Yankees, and we don't care if it takes you 50 years. We want them dead. We hate them." Those are the letters that I have found, that's what the women are saying. But often the men aren't necessarily receiving those letters right away, and they're writing home saying, "I'm going to get home if I have to. If I have to just desert, I'll come home. I want to protect you." And their letters are constantly like, "I haven't heard from you. I haven't heard from you. I don't know what's happening, and that's scaring me. That's worrying me." So in that way, Sherman's march changes the course of the war because the soldiers are demoralized. So it was more directly aimed at the women, but it did produce the desired effect by getting the men to sort of realize that they were hopeless. They couldn't do what they had planned to do.
Fair enough, Dr. Frank. Well, thank you so much for taking some time out of your day. Again, everyone, the book is The Civilian War, Confederate Women and Union Soldiers During Sherman's March, out with LSU Press. Certainly a book you want to read if you've got an interest on Sherman's March, if you've got an interest in the Confederate quote-unquote home front, if you're a big fan of gender studies, of the war. It's a wonderful work, and again, I think it provides just another wrinkle in obviously what Mark Grimsley called the hard hand of war. This is very much a hard war, and you can see its impact upon the Southern populace right here in this work. So Dr. Frank, thank you so much for coming on. Perhaps we could have you on in the future.
Thank you very much, Dave. I enjoyed it.